And so we have a South Asian twist to the idea of a book talk or a book discussion. I'm Ashutosh Varshney, director of the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia and professor in political science. It's a pleasure to welcome you all and for this book Adda, which features Migrants and Machine Politics, How India's Urban Poor Seek Representation and Responsiveness, by Adam Auerbach, who can't be here, and Tariq Thachil, who is here.
In that order of importance.
Let me say something substantive first before introducing our speaker and then later on the three commentators. The countryside, rural politics, rural political economy have been a major preoccupation of scholars of South Asia and also Southeast Asia, no longer East Asia, which is very urban by now. And that's primarily because, as I just hinted, even though urbanization has picked up over the last decade and a half, South Asia is still primarily rural. 2011 data, a census said 68% rural, 32% urban. 2021 census has not been held. It should be, if by census yardsticks, it should be 64-36 or 63-37. And if we go by some scholars who don't necessarily agree with the census definition of urban, for example, Partha Mukhopadhyay at the Center for Policy Research, then India is probably 45 to 50% urban, which is hard for me to accept, but I have no statistical basis for challenging Partha Mukhopadhyay. That India is close to 50% urban and China 62% urban is Partha's point. At any rate, it's substantially urban now and it's becoming more urban. But because the scholarship was so focused on rural issues, we now have a new generation of scholars emerging who are studying urban India in its various facets and aspects. 4 members of the new scholarly generation are here. The person who will present his book and the 3 commentators, and you can include me also in that, because 2 of my co-PIs and co-authors on our 17-city urban governance project from India are commenting, and I'm simply moderating. And this year is a big writing year for us. We published a little bit already. So, with those words, let me introduce Tariq, who's been here quite a few times, 2-3 times, I think, to Watson and to our center, which used to be India Initiative at one point. He's a professor of political science and Madan Lal Sobti Chair for the Study of Contemporary India and director of the Center for the Advanced Study of India that all of us in the profession know as CASI. C-A-S-I, CASI. It's more than 25 years old. I think could be close to 30 years old. Yes? Yeah. Our center is a baby, but CASI is 30 years old. And his first book, which he presented here some years ago, dealt with how elite parties can use social services to win mass support through a study of Hindu nationalism. And it was a Cambridge Press book, which won the Gregory Lubert Award for the best book in comparative politics. Always a difficult award to get and a very competitive one. and the 2015 Leon Epstein Award for the best book on political parties, both from American Political Science Association. This is a second book, co-authored with Adam and published by Princeton, and it focuses on, primarily, the empirical materials focus on two cities, Bhopal and Jaipur. Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh, Jaipur in Rajasthan. We are not studying in our project Jaipur. In our project, we are studying Bhopal. These are by demographic or population standards, class 1 cities. They are big, but not as big as the city of Mumbai or Delhi, or what are called the metros. They should be, Bhopal should be a couple of million. Jaipur should be a couple of million, little bit more. And of course, Delhi, Mumbai are 10 million, 8 to 10 million, that's where they are. Bangalore's 7 million, etc. So it's about machine politics, the application of a concept, I think for the first time, this concept, machine politics, to Indian urban politics story. And migrants have been studied a lot, especially in Mumbai, but migrants and machine politics together have not been studied. This is where this book is distinctive, and I might also add that a political science point for those from my department here, my discipline here, slums or shanty towns are always inserted in our discipline, political science, into patron-client networks of politics, functioning primarily as recipients of some goods: housing, electricity, water, sanitation, jobs, in return for their votes. So it's this very vast literature now over the last 15 years of clientelism, which covers slums in particular, but not only slums, but slums in particular, which is the focus of these books. This book. And Adam and Tariq are saying that their slum dwellers are hardly passive recipients. They have agency. And the agency consists in negotiating between various patrons or brokers and extracting the most beneficial relationships for themselves out of that. I've read quite a bit on machine politics in late 19th century America. And that idea is sort of not as prominent. It's there. It's not there. It's not there, but it's not prominently, does not prominently feature on the newer Irish arrivals in Boston, New York, Italian arrivals in New York, and Chicago. By 1880, Chicago was a fairly big city. By 1900, it was the second largest city, etc. So essentially, if you read that, it says migrants come from Italy, from Ireland. Politicians say, "Give me your vote, and I'll get you your child admission to a school, or I'll get you access to housing. Give me your vote." And it is in a way transactional, but it's not. The focus is not on agency of these migrants. Migrants are receiving something and saying, "Okay, I'll give you my vote." So this logic is questioned by the materials here, and in what way you will hear. I will introduce the three commentators later. Let's begin with 40 minutes of Tariq's account of his book, and then we'll have 12 minutes each from the commentators, and then we'll open up. If Tariq wants to respond to the three commentators, he will have time. Otherwise, we'll have Q&A from the audience. So welcome, Tariq, once again.
Thanks so much, Ashu. And if I'd known you were going to give such a good summary of the book, then I would have just said, let's go straight to the commentators. I can sit back, relax. The book is written. There's pretty much nothing I can do about anything. So let's just have a chat. But more seriously, thank you so much. When Adam said he couldn't come, I was delighted to get Ashu's call to come and present my work. I'm joking, Ashu. He wishes he could be here, and it's been a formative space for us. We've presented different portions of both this project and other work that we've done on urban politics at both the initiative and now the center. And it's great to see the growing community of South Asia scholars at Brown and students. It's wonderful to engage with them. I'm looking forward to what the discussants have to say. So let me just, what I'm going to try and do in today's talk is give you in the front half just a general overview of the book project. What is it that we're trying to do, some of which draws on what Ashu has mentioned. And then in the second part, I'll just present just a couple of the empirical findings, because I think for most of you who wouldn't have read the book, it may be helpful to have a sense of like some of the findings that we have. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to kind of present some of the overall findings of the book, and then we can get into the discussion. So the book Migrants and Machine Politics that both Adam and I have been working on, the last time I was here for a book Adda was 2015, so that gives you a sense of how long it takes me to write a book, even when I have a great co-author. But the book that we were set out to write was really motivated by what Ashu mentioned at the beginning, which is this idea of significant urbanization across much of the global south. And there are different estimates of this, but if you think of West Africa, Noah Nathan estimates about 100 million more urban residents than in 1990. In China, the urban population has more than tripled over the past 4 decades. And the UN estimates in its demographic projections that almost all global population growth over the next 3 decades is going to happen in cities. So actually, rural population globally is going to dip slightly. Urban population is going to go up by an estimated about 2 billion, 90% of which is going to happen in Asia and Africa. And India is actually going to be an important contributor to this demographic shift. As Ashu mentioned, it's still a predominantly rural countryside. This is just all the towns, all the urban spaces in India mapped. But the first decade of the 21st century was also the first in which the country added more people to its cities than to its villages. We don't know the next census because we haven't had it yet. But again, projections from the UN suggest about 400 million people are going to be added to Indian cities in the next 3 decades. This is more than number 2 and number 3 combined, China and Nigeria. And from a political scientist point of view, there's been heated debates on the political consequences of this profound demographic shift. Is urbanization going to activate or mute ethnic conflict? Is it going to enable class-based political mobilization? Or will it enhance identification with the national state over more local and parochial identities? All of these are things that scholars have discussed. But nearly all such debates, to some degree, have revolved around the fate of recent arrivals to the city. As Ashu mentioned, these could have been transnational immigrants from Ireland and Italy flocking to US cities during the Gilded Age, or internal rural to urban migrants flocking to cities across the global south, including countries like India. But unlike the movement from farm to factory in Europe, migrants to cities in much of the global south predominantly work and live in informal conditions. And so in the context of their habitation, often these migrant communities are forced to settle in what are called informal squatter settlements, or more colloquially and popularly, slums. It's hard to get a fixed, precise estimate on the number of people living in slums globally, but we've pegged the figure as around 1 billion people. In India, according to the last census, which is now over 10 years old, it was 65 million people, which is largely regarded as an underestimate, for reasons I'm happy to get into. But if we put it around 65 to 100 million, whatever it is, it's tens of millions of people. It's a significant chunk of humanity. And so the question in our book is, there's a lot of discussion, both in academic but also in policy circles, about the transformative potential of urbanization. But a lot of whether that potential will actually be realized depends in some significant degree not just on how these migrant communities will be economically included, which is often the focus of discussion, but how they're going to be politically included as well, or not, the degree to which they will be. And in many ways, the political life of slums is primarily, not solely, but primarily described as deprived, dispossessed, and coerced. And we're not suggesting that these don't have elements of truth in it in the book, to be clear, and I'll come back to that at the end. But one thing that's missing, with notable exceptions, including one of the co-panelists today, there's been very little of these assessments of slum political life that's actually based on sustained engagement with the communities themselves and trying to understand their internal politics. In particular, how do they relate to mainstream political organizations, such as political parties, which is the focus of our work? And that might lead us to ask, what are the kinds of party organizations that integrate poor migrants during periods of urbanization? Not just in India, but how we thought about this. And certainly in political science, as Ashu mentioned, the dominant organization that's been focused on is something called the party machine. Ashu alluded to what machine politics is, but since this is the title, let me just briefly explain what we mean by it. Party machines are said to have three distinguishing features. First, as Ashu mentioned, they avoid affiliating or reaching out to voters on the basis of policy appeals, but instead target the distribution of some kind of material benefit in return for support. Now, that benefit could target an individual voter. In this case, it could be like a public sector job at the high end or a petty handout at election time at the low end. Or it could target a small collectivity of voters, things like paved roads, storm drains, or street lights. But whatever the benefit type, the flow of benefits for votes is said to be managed through hierarchical organizations that link, and this is the second distinguishing feature of machines, clients, in machine politics parlance, the voters, often termed the machine's clients, at the bottom, being linked to political elites or patrons at the top through these intermediary broker figures. And the idea being that benefits are funneled from the patron to the client through these organizations, and the broker then also monitors the reciprocity of voters who are receiving the benefit. Are they actually voting in return as well? So that's managed through these organizations. And these organizations, in turn, are organized geographically. This is the third key distinguishing feature of these kinds of political organizations, with individual brokers that you can see here, often in charge of little clutches of voters, and brokers themselves may be nested in the larger electoral domain of a patron. And across a large city, you might have several of these patrons, each at the apex of their own local machine organization, spread out across a city. And as Ashu mentioned, there's an expansive literature documenting these urban machines, not specific to India, not specific even to the global south. The Democratic Party machines in New York and Chicago, the Republican Party machine where I live and work in Philadelphia, but also this proliferation of scholarship documenting similar kinds of organizations across the global south, influentially in Latin America, examples like the Argentine Peronists or the Mexican PRI, but also extending out to cases like Accra in Ghana or even Mumbai. So across a century of scholarship, the fates of these kinds of machines and migrants have been seen as tightly intertwined. And for good reason, the material inducements these organizations offer are seen to be especially attractive to the disoriented new arrivals, to use Jim Scott's term, who are lacking political connections, social standing, and economic clout in their destination cities. But one of the consequences of this kind of top-down focus of how machines kind of prey on immigrant and migrant communities has been a couple of things that we point out in the book. Firstly, it's been an overwhelming focus on parties that are locally dominant. So again, the Peronists in Argentina, the Mexican PRI, these are dominant incumbents who squeeze out political competition. And so the sense of machine politics is it's one that lacks competition. Secondly, there's an overwhelming focus, and we've done a review of studies, the overwhelming focus, over 80% of them, focus on machine politics during elections, not between the vote. And a lot of this then leads to questions of how patrons at the top, these party elites, enforce compliance. So how do these machines act as these disciplining devices to enforce compliance among the voters they give benefits to? How do they make sure that the quid pro quo is maintained? If I give you benefits, that you're reciprocating. Indeed, this is often what is thought to compel them to hire these brokers in the first place, to act as their local eyes and ears, not just dispensing benefits, but making sure the vote is returned. In places like Africa and South Asia, this also leads machines, and even in the American context, to target groups that are of their same ethnicity, with the idea that this monitoring, punishment, surveillance is easier achieved through ethnic networks. So we get a bunch of stylized facts about these organizations, in which voters are largely seen as these passive targets. As Ashu mentioned, they lack choice, agency, and in Stokes's influential phrase, are perversely accountable to the parties that give them benefits. And this in India aligns with popular media and Bollywood portrayals of slums as vote banks, a term that I read is often pejorative, indicating voters who are either coerced or cheaply bought off by local dons and vote largely along either caste or faith lines. And we argue in the book that this focus on how
You don't want to read your emails.
Definitely not. Focus on how machines enforce during the vote has led to this striking neglect of how they form between the vote. And a focus on actually how these organizations form was brought home to us when we started looking at individual slum settlements that we were working with in India. So this is the settlement of Jawahar Nagar in eastern Jaipur that was built in the 1970s. It was initially squatted by a few dozen families on the eastern sand dunes of the city. And this is what Jawahar Nagar looked like. This was a photograph shared with us by a resident, one of the initial residents to move here. Since then, Jawahar Nagar has expanded. This is a roughly similar photo in orientation of Jawahar Nagar today. This is just one small part of the settlement. It's now expanded to over 20,000 residents. You'll also notice that in addition to the housing becoming more permanent and dense, there are now political flags and symbols, including of a very prominent local leader, Rafiq Khan, who was a migrant who moved to the city and has now assumed a position of importance in local politics. But Rafiq Khan is not alone. He is affiliated to the Indian National Congress, but there are 100 other party workers like him in this settlement. And the question that we had was, none of them moved to the city as political leaders. They became political leaders in this setting. These party networks did not exist in Jawahar Nagar at this time. So what happened to actually create these political networks? How did that process take shape? Our book tries to trace the ongoing formation of urban party machines in Jaipur and Bhopal, and we focus on two political parties, the Indian National Congress and the Hindu Nationalist BJP, which are the dominant parties both in these cities, and the two national parties across India as well. And one of the reasons we focus, there are many reasons we focus on Jaipur and Bhopal for both empirical and theoretical reasons, but one point that Ashu mentioned that I'll reiterate is that they're two of India's 50, by Indian standards, mid-sized million-plus cities. So India actually only has 3 cities that have officially a population of more than 10 million, but it has 50 cities with a population between 1 and 10, and Jaipur and Bhopal are 2 of those. And so in these cities, over a 5-year period, we combine nearly 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork with surveys and survey experiments that we draw on our ethnography to design and implement with every layer of the machine's anatomy. So we survey clients or voters in 2 waves in 2013 and 15. We surveyed intermediary brokers in 2016 and local elites, political elites in 2017. And we also follow this up with hundreds of interviews at each layer of this machine's anatomy. And the book details a lot of what we learned from that, but one point I want to draw to your attention that struck us was the intense competition we witnessed between and within party machines at all 3 anatomical levels. So we witnessed slum brokers competing for the support of residents. Oh, sorry, question, yeah? Quick question. Yeah.
When you interviewed the citizens or surveys,
yeah. It wasn't a panel. No, it was very difficult. We do a panel with brokers, which I'm happy to talk about, but with the citizens, we also didn't get any identifying info, and so we didn't. It's a 2-wave non-panel survey. We tried to do a panel and COVID put paid to that, so didn't make it. But in addition to that, we saw city patrons competing over influential slum brokers, residents competing for attention from their local brokers, and brokers and patrons competing for promotion within party organizations. And all of this competition informs a key argument in the book that competition is actually central to machine politics. And machines actually form through an interlocking set of competitive selection decisions in which poor migrants, brokers, and politicians choose and repeatedly choose one another. And it's through those selections that actually aggregate to constitute the networks that link migrants to the hearts of city politics. And our focus on competitive selection raises a number of questions that we argue have been largely unasked by prior studies of urban machine politics and political science. And those are the questions we kind of structure the book around. So we ask and sequentially answer. To begin with, who becomes a broker? How does somebody emerge to brokerage within a slum settlement? And we argue that it's actually being selected by local residents. It's a bottom-up selection that drives the creation of brokers. Once they're selected, we then ask, and this is chapter 2, we then ask, how do brokers decide which voters to cultivate as their clients and as their support base? And these 2 decisions, we argue together, help collectively constitute the network within a slum. We then look in chapter 4 of how does the wider world of city politics enter into this by looking at which of the many brokers bubbling up within slum settlements do local party organizations decide to include in their network. And then how do political patrons decide which of the many requests they get from brokers on behalf of slum residents to prioritize fulfilling. And these decisions we analyze in chapter 5 of the book. So very briefly, what does this mean? Part of the argument of the book is it's not just a description of how machines form, but arguing that that understanding helps understand how they function. And sometimes the implications cut against conventional top-down portrayals of machine politics and popular portrayals of urban slum politics in India. So for example, competition being central to machine politics also affords dimensions of accountability and responsiveness within limits, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but that are often missed when analyzing this style of politics. That migrants, who are often dismissed from kind of political narratives in India, actually use competition not just to exert agency. I think that can be a kind of trite way of putting it. We're actually arguing that they're shaping and populating the machines that govern them, right? They're actually even ascending into the political networks that govern them. We also think that the role of ethnicity is there, but often overstated. In contexts like India, there's often a singular focus on people casting their vote, voting their caste, those unhelpful aphorisms. And while the caste and faith may matter, we show that there's actually overlooked indicators of competence, for example, education, which are very rarely emphasized in political selection accounts in India, that often matter just as much, if not more. And finally, a point that Lisa and others have made, we corroborate that this focus on buying of the vote, including in journalistic accounts of slum elections in India, is far less important than everyday problem solving between the vote. Okay. Just for the rest of the talk, just for 15, 20 minutes, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we find in this first, like who becomes a broker, and then which of these brokers gets selected, just to give you a sense of how this chain forms, and I'll end with that. So on brokers, there's a large and geographically diverse, like this figure of the broker has animated a large and geographically diverse and interdisciplinary scholarship, which documents the presence of them in different parts of the world. They go by different names. In India, they may go by fixers, dalals, naya netas. In Western and Sub-Saharan Africa, they may go by tribal chiefs or marabouts. They may go by capituleros and punteros in Latin America. But whatever the name, scholars have often assumed that these leaders exist, but not necessarily examined how they rose into positions of authority. And in our context, we first documented in 2013 that these forms of informal leaders are pervasive and important. So they exist. Over 3/4 of surveyed residents acknowledge community leadership, and they're important. Roughly half of respondents said they'd visited someone for help within the last year. And what do they do? So they do a range of things. At the highest end, this brokerage role really comes through. The number one thing that people say they get help with is raising demands to politicians, serving as this intermediary microphone to politicians, but also help with obtaining documents or resolving dispute. Brokers may do a range of things. And so the question becomes, how do these people come up? How do they actually take place? And here, interviews with residents, with brokers themselves, and with political elites all reinforced one thing, which is that they predominantly emerge through this bottom-up community support. Parties cannot just dispatch people to become brokers in settlements, nor can they just bestow authority on someone who doesn't have a popular following locally. And so, for example, residents we spoke to kept using the language of choice. We chose them so that they can help us. Leaders help the poor people who have no one in the government to go to, so we've chosen them for this reason. Our local leaders, we've chosen them because they have information and knowledge. We then actually asked 262 brokers, we interviewed and gave them an open-ended chance to just narrate their rise to power. Adam and I then personally read those transcripts and tried to analyze how that worked, and the vast majority, over 80%, first built a following in the slum and then were approached by a political party, not the reverse order. And even patrons concurred. They said, look, someone from the community emerges as a strong leader, has a public following. In that case, we approach him and ask and give him a position. We even asked, could you make an outsider a leader in the slum? And we were told, no, an outsider would not have any mahatva, any importance within the settlement. A local from the settlement will know each and every resident. And this choice, we argue in the book, is fundamentally enabled by competition. We document over 1,000 acknowledged leaders across the 110 slums we collect data in. Only 3 settlements were there where we had no sample respondent acknowledging any form of leadership. So it's, again, pervasive competition. And we asked, how is such choice then exercised? And we found 2 ways that we document. The first are discrete moments, like large baithaks, community meetings, or informal elections. About 4 in 10 respondents said they chose their leaders through some kind of discrete mechanism. And we observed this ourselves in what we call Saraswati slum, sorry, the picture is so dark, which was facing eviction. people actually decided they need a leader, so they held an election that we witnessed, complete with informal paper ballots, and they asked the local police to come and oversee the counting of the ballots. They formed an election committee from residents who specified that the president had to be from the slum, that if they were found of wrongdoing, they could be removed from their position, and that canvassing had to stop 24 hours before elections, mimicking the model code of conduct in Indian formal elections. 3 candidates came forward. Jagdish defeated Prem by 141 votes. The third candidate was removed for public drunkenness the eve before the election. And Jagdish is being garlanded as the victor. But in addition to these discrete moments, a second, more fluid pathway is just a kind of decentralized voting with your feet. Residents make decisions about which broker to seek help from and follow, and those decisions can aggregate into larger patterns of support. And so if slum leaders emerge through this bottom-up selection process for aspiring broker in the settlement, they have to be able to signal to a critical mass of residents that they are the most likely to get things done. And so one of the things we look at in the book is what types of brokers do residents say they prefer? When they're looking at different aspirants, how do they choose which one to kind of go to? And to do this, one of the empirical contributions of the book is trying to create representative samples of residents in slums. This is not straightforward. We don't have like a sampling frame we can just download to do this. So we combined satellite imagery and municipal lists to identify the universe of squatter settlements, about just over 400 in 2 cities. We then identified actual squatter settlements through field visits, and the total of 307 remained. From that, we sample a population stratified random sample of 110 settlements, 80 in wave 1, 110 in wave 2, and then residents within the slum. And that's one of this is just to give you a visual sense of what this looks like. Again, sorry, it's a bit dark. Each of these is basically a slum settlement. The 2 points I want you to just note, this is in one part of Bhopal South Assembly constituency, but the 2 points I want you to mention, which scholars of urban politics in India will know, one is that the slums are super variable in size. You can make that out from here. So there are really small slums, really big slums. They're very irregular, and that has to do with how slums form. I'm happy to talk about that in our city, where do they form and why. But the other point is that they're distributed through the city. So in most Indian cities, you're not going to see slums just dotting the periphery. They're really through the city, and that's true in both of our study cities. So on the experiment itself that we did, when we're trying to identify who residents want as a broker, we present them with 2 hypothetical slum residents running for the president of an informal Vikas Samiti or development association in a slum similar to theirs. And we were just asked, which of these 2 would you prefer to support? I'm not going to go into the details of this. I'm just going to present some of the findings. But I will mention that this is how we kind of used ethnography. We found that these associations were widespread vehicles in our slums through which brokers made claims on behalf of residents. And so, for example, across different slums, we were given by different brokers the letterheads of these development councils they would set up. They would then register them with the municipality, and almost always there would be the list of committee members of the council, and the head would be an adhyaksha, president, would always be an influential leader. So this is something that would make sense to our respondents. And we basically gave them different information about these candidates running for this president's position. Their subcaste or jati, their faith, their region of origin, and their party, which was sometimes the same as the respondent, sometimes different. And we also varied their education and occupation. I would say these are more typical. We can talk about why we had these different traits, but these are more typical standard in political selection models, what people think people want, the same ethnic group, the same party group. These are somewhat less salient typically, but we thought these were important because our informants told us. So with education, we randomized whether a broker was highly educated, medium, or low, and partly this was from the centrality of written claim making for slum leaders' activities. And our informants told us this. They said, look, they need help, residents, with anything that needs literacy, filling up of ID cards, of ration cards. As they say in the blind world, the one-eyed man is king. On occupation, we varied a broker's job to indicate a level of connectivity to municipal authorities, who are often the agencies that get the things done that slum residents want, cleaning of gutters, installing of streetlights. And here we had low levels of connectivity jobs that constrain a resident to the world of the slum, going up to high connectivity jobs that place them in proximity of the municipal office. So like sweepers or clerks, these are jobs that slum residents can and do have. And again, inspired by a resident who said, even a man is just a security guard at the municipal office. His bosses would be important people he sees every day. So if he asks them to make sure the municipality sends sweepers to clean our gutters, won't it be more likely they listen to him? So very quickly on our findings, I won't go through like all of these different details, just for those who are unfamiliar with these kinds of choice experiments. Essentially what this is telling you is the impact of a broker having the same caste versus having a different caste from the respondent in increasing the likelihood of a given profile being picked among the two that they were presented with. And very briefly, what we find from this is that, yeah, people who are of the same caste are preferred. People who are the same religion are preferred. Interestingly, people who are from the same state in India, which is not typically seen as significant in political selection. We focus a lot on religion and caste, not so much on region, but these are multi-regional settlements where we have people from many provinces of India. That also matters. We see a penalty against Muslim leaders. So Muslim leaders are disfavored relative to upper caste leaders, not so for Dalit leaders. And then finally, what we find, I'll just focus on one here, we do find that municipal job holders are preferred to those who reside inside the slum. But the difference of going from uneducated to college educated is actually the largest single effect that we find on the survey, and in a direct comparison is actually larger than the effect of shared caste. Furthermore, in other analysis, we find that education can actually substitute for a lack of shared ethnicity in broker preferences. And the high diversity of urban slums in our two study cities actually constrain the utility of caste, in particular, jati, as a tool for political coalition building. So only about 30% of residents had a member of their caste even available to them as a leader. So most residents don't have a member of their caste even among the brokers of a settlement. Should we believe these results? Just go ahead and believe them. No. So there are a couple of concerns that we also have as scholars with these kinds of hypothetical choice exercises. The first is, do they even align with real world decisions? And we talk about some other things in the book, but I think that one's a really important one. People can say a lot of things, but what actually happens? So one way we try to get around this is by actually looking at who are the actual leaders in settlements. And so this requires surveying slum leaders. Sorry, is that a question? Oh, okay. This is required surveying slum leaders. And so if serving residents was hard, serving leaders is even tougher because there's definitely no list of them. So we actually we crowdsourced this by asking survey respondents on our citizens, please name leaders in your settlement. Anybody who was named more than once was included. This is to prevent somebody saying, oh, my uncle, I'm a leader. My uncle's a leader. So it has to be mentioned more than once. We then, Adam and I created a census of party workers by visiting party offices and collecting membership rosters. Any confirmed party worker was included in our sample. And this final sample was about 914 leaders across 110 settlements. Through a process that took whatever hair was left on my head, we interviewed 629. And basically, we looked at whether we could combine data from this survey and our resident survey to assess if the kinds of residents who become brokers are distinguished by the attributes that, like education, that residents said they want. And before I get to that, what we do find quite amazingly about slum leaders is how ethnically diverse they are. So over 160 different subcastes are represented. All castes and faiths are represented in leadership. 11 different states among our sample of leaders. They're predominantly, but not exclusively, male. And the 12% who are female, you can think of that as low or high, but I think it's not trivial, given that there's no quotas for this. Anybody who is a female leader here has real political authority, is definitely not any kind of proxy. And most of them have to hold jobs outside brokerage. This is not financially viable as a full-time occupation. And the vast majority affiliate with parties. So are brokers more educated than residents? Considerably so. They're much less likely to be uneducated, much more likely to be college educated, kind of like we might expect to find. And then we look a little bit more systematically at this in a regression format, and essentially the greens show findings that align in distinguishing brokers from residents with our choice experiment. So we do find positive selection for college education, 8th grade education. We find positive selection for high and medium connectivity jobs. We actually find that being from the largest caste, you're kind of underrepresented in leadership ranks. The one thing we do not find is a penalty against Muslims. So we found that in the choice experiment, but we don't find that Muslim leaders are actually underrepresented as a proportion of the population. I'm happy to talk about that. But one point I do want to note is that education in our sample does not correlate with income. Very weakly correlates with income. So in many studies, education is a proxy of like being very elite. In our sample of slum residents, it actually correlates very weakly. It's less than 0.2. And even when we control for income, the effect of education is really what pops. Okay, last 5 minutes, let me talk about, you get brokers coming up, then parties have to swoop in. So what happens here? Well, firstly, this is an important question because brokers themselves want to be in parties. 9 out of 10 said the thing they want the most out of their brokerage is a party position or a pad. Why? Well, firstly, it helps them get things done for their clients. It's a source of their popularity. If you get things done, you can use, a lot of these brokers, for example, will have letterheads with their name and the party symbol, in this case the Congress, to lend heft to their claim-making efforts. But also, and this is sometimes overlooked, brokers are ambitious. They don't just want to be perpetual intermediaries. And in our sample, they're thinking that this can be a launching pad for a career in city politics. I don't just want to be a slum broker. And so 415 of the 629 brokers we surveyed had a party pad. And one of the things we looked at is the career trajectories of these 415 brokers. So this is, the bars indicate the number of pads they had positions. So they had 2, these are 3. And the height indicates the level, the rank, going all the way from the slum level position to the ward to the city and district. And just to note for you what's happening here, about a third of slum brokers just get 1 position, okay? But about a quarter of them get 3 positions, and these follow an upward rank. So the third position is about 1 level higher than the first position that they started with. Why am I saying all this? Well, because it means that it's not just wishful thinking. Getting included, there is a chance of upward ascension into party politics, but it's a slippery slope. Only 1 in 5 are going to make it to a citywide post. But I think this is also what we mean by migrants are not just have agency, they're actually populating. I mean, a city and district and these kinds of posts are not trivial posts in mainstream party organizations. So who gets selected? This is the last bit I'll end with. We interviewed patrons, and they are these low patrons, ward level party leaders, what we call kind of low patrons. These kind of local bosses are the ones who really integrate slum leaders. Who do they decide to integrate? When we talked to them, they had a couple of different concerns. First, they were very freaked out about loyalty. These are very competitive conditions again, and brokers can and do switch parties. So openly, over 1 in 4 brokers told us they had switched parties, which may be even an underestimate, given the kind of direction of desirability bias. And they'll say things often indicating their ambition. I was in the BJP, but if the person above you wants to curb your talent, you cannot let your talent be curbed. I'm not married to the BJP. I can move to the Congress, which salutes me and says, come join us, Sahib. We'll respect you. We'll give you a post. In addition to that, though, they also have concerns of personal loyalty. So it's not just will you be loyal to our party, but are you going to be loyal to me? And this is salient in both our cities, which are rife with intra-party factionalism. So as one patron told us, party workers work hard only for those who are close to them. So he was in the Congress party. He said, there are 10 workers of Congress, but only 2 are close to me, as compared to the 8 workers who work more for other leaders. Sometimes you have to fight people in your own party. And this, we argue, might actually compel where ethnicity might matter. And in particular, jati, a kind of close-knit identity, might be used by patrons as a kind of proxy for who's more likely to be loyal to not just the party, but me within the party as well. But it's not enough to just get a loyal broker. At the end of the day, you want somebody who's effective and who has a following. That's what you're integrating in the party to deliver. And often we focus on election time efficacy in the larger scholarship, an indicator of which is campaign rallies. In the parlance of one of our patrons, can he fill buses? Can someone bring someone to an election rally? That's what I'm looking for in a broker. But as part of our book is trying to show, popularity with clients is a little bit less about what's happening at election time and more a function of their everyday problem-solving efficacy, which we've argued education is often used as an indicator for, and patrons even said they used education as an indicator as well. So final results I'll show you is what we did, basically the similar kind of choice experiment, but instead of asking residents, which broker do you prefer, we asked patrons, who would you give a party position to at the ward level? Which one of these would you pick? And what we find interestingly is that once again, ethnicity matters, but only this narrow caste. If you remember with voters, both of these mattered as well. State and religion do not matter here. Just that narrow caste identity does, which we say really shows that ethnicity is being used as an indicator of loyalty. If I was using ethnicity to build up a vote bank, I should actually pick a broader dimension. I should pick something like region or pick something like faith, but that's not what's going on. They strongly prefer people from their party. In this case, people who are co-partisans, over poaching rival defectors. And there is a trade-off here, because party patrons are constantly thinking, should we pick someone from the rival network and poach them, or should we reward our loyalists? In terms of their efficacy, we actually find, once again, education mattered the most. college education was more significant, and the number of people that somebody was said to bring to a rally was actually not that important. So once again, education was the strong preference, mirroring the preference among residents. Again, you might say everyone's just telling Tariq what they think. He's a college professor, and they just want to say that education matters a lot. But once again, when we draw on data from our broker survey, so this was an interview we did in 2017 with patrons. We drew on data from our brokers in 2016 who got promoted. And essentially what we find is we try and see who gets promoted within party organizations. And what we find is that actually an increase in education correlates with an increase in the positional rank you get and how much you differ from your first to your last position, how much upward mobility do you get. And we again find positive effects of everyday claim making, but not really of election time activities. Finally, we find that party loyalty matters. Going from attending party meetings once a year to once a month correlates with an increase in your positional rank. So again, I'll just wrap up here. This is just to give you kind of a peek of some of the findings that we have. But I think what I'll just tell you in conclusion is what we try and wrestle with in the conclusion of the book, which is 3 points. One, is there any resonance to this beyond Jaipur and Bhopal? Is there any resonance to this beyond India? And again, I don't think our goal is to say our exact argument holds everywhere, but where are the resonances and where are they not? I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. The second thing we wrestle with are the limits to this. So we are trying to push quite hard to say there are accountability and responsiveness dynamics within machine politics that are overlooked, but we do not want to be saying that life, and nobody can spend time in slum settlements in India and come out of it saying everything is working super well. And I'm happy to give examples of where I think there are real hard limits to this and constraints to this model and what it can deliver. Finally, those of you who follow Indian politics may say, you're writing a book about the vibrancy of local politics at a time where every article I read on India is about centralization of politics, centralization of political power. And you're writing about this very nice story about people building multi-ethnic coalitions. Ethnicity may not matter that much at a time where people think that we're getting an increasingly polarized and majoritarian system. So we wrestle with that in the book too, is that how do those things sit together? What are the implications of one for the other? And again, that's something I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But thank you so much. I'll end it there. Thank you for your time. Look forward to the comments.
So we have invited, we begin with big city gaze first onto our small cities, or they're not small, they're 2 million, but if you've studied, if this is a small city, Providence, 185,000. But if you are from the city of Mumbai, or you've studied Mumbai all your life, which should be at least at 20 million easily, 18 to 20, right? Depends on where you draw the boundary.
Depends on the time of day.
Yeah. When you are a scholar of Mumbai politics, then it's interesting to see what that gaze will yield. What that gaze will yield on what for Mumbai and Delhi and Chennai and Kolkata is basically a small town. They would use the term small town. It's not a small town. No, but they use the term small town. बड़ा शहर छोटे शहर के बारे में कैसे सोचता है? So I have invited Lisa Borkman for that. She has enlightened us all about Mumbai with several pieces of work. She's on the Faculty of Urban and Public Affairs at the University of Louisville, Kentucky. Political ethnographer. One book that we read here in a book Adda was Pipe Politics, Contested Waters, Embedded Infrastructures in Millennial Mumbai. Then other books include Waiting Town, Life in Transit in Mumbai's Other World-Class Histories. The latest is Bombay Brokers. And my favorite is an article in American Ethnologist called You Can't Buy a Vote. Meanings of Money in Mumbai Elections. You Can't Buy a Vote is the title of that wonderful paper. So welcome once again, Lisa.
I should say that be careful what you title your articles, because the You Can't Buy a Vote article, which was a direct quote, everyone refers to as my vote buying article. Can I just sit here or should I
Yeah,
stand? I
yeah.
can stand as well.
Sure. No, whichever. Whatever. Yeah.
Ah, I guess I'll stand. So you said 12 to 15 minutes, so I've prepared my interventions around 15 minutes.
Okay.
But feel free to cut me off if I go too long. I enjoyed reading this tremendously. It was accessibly written, which for someone who is, I'm actually trained as a political scientist, but mostly I'm an anthropologist, and so I don't read quantitative work as much, but I found this eminently accessible and engagingly written. So I think I'm hoping that this will be really widely read across disciplines. And there's so many intersections with questions that I've been working on that it was very difficult to decide how to spend my 15 minutes. So that's why I've written my remarks so I can try and stay focused. So the book shows how, again, as you've just unpacked, the urban poor are extraordinarily savvy in selecting and forging relations of political representation that render their claims effective. And moreover, you show that the everyday city life between elections is where political authority is actually constituted, which of course is the opposite of what so much sort of received wisdom tells us. You show that political authority isn't bestowed from above by party higher-ups, but rather it emerges through this everyday work of informal representatives or political brokers who connect the urban poor with the offices of local government. So one of my very favorite chapters of the book was the first substantive chapter about how brokers emerge, where you draw on this large survey about how residents evaluate neighborhood leaders. And what you show is that while it's often presumed that ethnic or religious or even partisan identities might be the most important predictor of political trust or confidence, low-income residents are looking for something rather different in their informal representatives: education, practical expertise, and demonstrated efficacy, performed efficacy in everyday problem solving. So I found something really similar in Mumbai, which is that people are eminently practical rather than identitarian or ideological in selecting their political representatives. And I think that this is a point that cannot be understated, the importance of which can't be understated, rather. So, of course, Mumbai is a very different city from the ones you're looking at. Your research focused not on megacities like Mumbai or Delhi, but rather small, tiny cities and towns. But from my perspective as a Mumbai scholar, it's really interesting that some of what I've been finding is evident in these very different smaller cities. The non-ideological character of political life, for instance. This was really striking for me. So given this really striking similarity, some of the differences in Mumbai also seem like they're worth airing or talking about. So again, I'm an ethnographer, so I'm going to begin by just describing two brokers that I want to kind of put on the table. So the first is a man I'm going to call Dalpat, who lives in a popular neighborhood, one that's commonly referred to as a slum and treated for political purposes as a slum, policy purposes as a slum. It dates from the 1970s. Even though the neighborhood is actually a slum resettlement colony, it's treated as a slum, which leaves residents vulnerable to spotty water taps and the criminalization of infrastructures and home repairs and so on. So it was in this context that I noted how a local building contractor and third-generation resident, Dalpat, whose between election work I had been studying at the time of, I guess it was a state election rolled around, he came to play a really important part, both in municipal and broader elections. So Dalpat himself had absolutely no interest in a political career. But when the election rolled around, everyone was asking for his advice. And this was because of Dalpat's reputation for a capacity, a demonstrated, proven capacity to build houses that don't get demolished. And this is a really powerful sign in this neighborhood of and performance of Dalpat's enduring translocal social and economic ties and access to resources. Water for curing concrete, for instance, which is hard. Sand. Like, can you get sand to appear? Can you somehow build a house that is, has a very sort of oblique relationship to building code and have it keep standing? The police don't come and so on. Sort of immunity to complaints by rival contractors. This kind of thing. So he And his houses were like a powerful testimony to his the strength of his translocal investment capital to do this work. Often he would be the investor in the houses that he would then sort of flip. So, this was a really powerful thing. He was reliably able to assemble all of these resources to build houses in a very complicated neighborhood. And this was a testimony to the strength of his networks. This also meant that when somebody's kid got in trouble with the police, he was often the first person that people came to because, his houses are still standing. He must have good connections with the police. So these sort of signs of authority is what I'm talking about here. Delpit, again, had no political aspirations, but he constantly found himself entertaining neighbors' requests for help. And he made time to do this because it was part of cultivating his reputation as a contractor. So here we see how reputation for local level political authority is enlisted in a non-political career trajectory. So the second broker I want to mention, and I should mention they never took fees for any of the brokering work that he did. The second broker I want to mention is a man I'll call Farid. And Farid is a self-described social worker whose activities I was following in the run-up to the 2017 municipal election. And Farid is the founder of a small, rabble-rousing NGO whose mission, as he described to me, is to create awareness about civic issues among the residents of the chawls and tenement buildings among which the NGO office is nestled. So he was working not in a so-called slum neighborhood, but a sort of low-income chawl area. So the weeks before polling in 2017, Farid's office was abuzz with business people and community leaders and social workers affiliated with all of the major parties, from left-wing socialists and Muslim identitarians to the regional Shiv Sena party. And so when I asked Farid about his proximity to a party with an on-again, off-again flirtation with majoritarianism and anti-migrant chauvinism, regional chauvinism, Farid shrugged. That's all just for show, dikavat. It's all acting, he said, using the English word acting. So I asked him to elaborate, and he said, see, if they're practical and they do our work, then I support them. Then he tells me that earlier that day, he had even gotten a call from the local BJP leader asking for his support. And he said, they need Muslim votes. One major party had offered Farid a ticket to contest the election in the neighboring district, but he declined the offer because he said he preferred to do his work through his NGO. So these two Bombay brokers are, what they do is they sort of echo some of your findings about the significance of connectivity as one of the most important qualities that residents are looking for in a broker. People with careers that allow them to circulate, as you point out, outside the neighborhood and forge relations with government offices and different forms of specialized knowledge and authority. The difference in Mumbai is the career trajectories and aspirations of these Bombay brokers are a little bit different, as well as the kind of knowledge and resources that they command and that the people who approach them are seeking to avail of. So people are reaching out to them not just because of their access to the state, although that's important too, but because they have access to all kinds of things, jobs in the private sector, visas, like whatever it is. People are so, there's like a much broader array of specialized expertise that people are looking for. Material resources in the case of, contractors, and he certainly is not the only contractor. So in Chapter 3, you're pointing to the careerist ambitions of most of the brokers that you encountered who seek upward mobility within party organizations, wanting a party ticket and perhaps to contest an election. But in Mumbai, becoming a politician is only one among many sort of possible career trajectories. And I didn't find it to be the most common or attractive one. And so that was quite interesting. And what I find in Mumbai is that actually for residents, overt political aspiration can be an object of suspicion. So not only among the wealthier classes, and that's something that we can talk about that more about in a minute, but also among the poor who prefer, or from what I understand, prefer to seek out the intermediation of people like a contractor or an NGO worker who sort of presents as less self-interested. And so I'm wondering what to make of this difference in the career trajectories of these brokers. And I'm also wondering about the sort of moral evaluative talk that gathers around brokers and their activities. So this was a key point in the book we just wrote, Bombay Brokers, was about, who is calling what brokerage or dalali, right? And so what kinds of work becomes sort of evaluated through this kind of talk. So you use the English word broker, although that's not an emic term. You talk about, Basti Neta, Mukhya, Pradhan, Rajnitik Karyakarta, these sorts of things. And I'm wondering whether less neutral terms are also in play, dalal, friend, these kinds of things. And dalal, of course, is a term which explicitly suggests that someone is profiteering off of an activity which ought not be the site of profit making. And I thought this was interesting because it's so clear that these are career aspirations. And of course, careers are like things you got to eat, right? Like people have to make money. And the fees, like I'm wondering where's the fees in your story and the talk about the fees. Because nobody really knows about fees at the end of the day. That's hard to study ethnographically. But what we can study is the way that people talk about fees. So the next point or question follows from your finding that voting isn't ideological about identity or platform, but rather about the remarkable savviness of voters in selecting who will get their work done. And as you show, voters rely on proven and trusted networks to help them sort through this terrain. Their loyalty is to particular people rather than to parties, residents' loyalty. And in Mumbai, of course, I've seen that when someone flips, whether it's a broker or a candidate, their whole publics will come with them, following their networks of trusted and proven leadership rather than maintaining allegiance to some sort of abstract ideology or this sort of thing. And in Mumbai, brokers are extremely ecumenical in their party alliances, maintaining, like Farid, ties with all parties, right? And this is like by design. It's not like, oh, I haven't picked one yet. Like this is part of their kind of shtick. So I'm curious to hear a bit more about why your research decided not to focus attention onto this selection field, about how brokers select parties, or any ideas you might have about this. And I'm asking this because in Mumbai, I find that this is perhaps the most contentious and competitive terrain during local elections, especially, which is where most of my research attention has been focusing. Party higher-ups are always trying to figure out who among the influential people at the local level has the trust of the public, and to court and invest in those individuals without alienating ticket-seeking brokers who might have followings that are underestimated. Right? And so which is to say, I find in Mumbai that the parties need the brokers more than the brokers need the parties. And I find this is really interesting because it complicates the kind of vertical assumption that the resources come from the parties from above and somehow, move. This is like the machine kind of model. And whereas if we think about the kind of translocal sorts of resources that people are looking for in their brokers, then actually some of what you talk about in the conclusion in terms of the dangers of centralization look a little bit different, right? Like if people are looking, or if political authority is constituted among people who have access to resources which are not about just the state, but in fact about regional, transnational economies and power networks, resources, capital, then things look a little bit different in terms of predicting what centralization might mean. Am I out of time?
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll be quick. This is the part I love most. Credit claiming. So chapter 5 is about how politicians choose which claims and petitions to prioritize. And you point out they prioritize these visible, spectacular ones to which their names can be tagged. I'll skip to the interesting part. So the point is that in this context, the built fabric of the city itself is a kind of canvas for this credit-claiming, communicative work. Like this is work of communication, especially during election season when political messages are communicated less in words, like spoken promises or media campaigns or speeches, but they're inscribed in city street spaces. So what strikes me in Mumbai always is the incredible literacy in the arts of political communication and the high-stakes work of interpretation that this entails. Okay, there's a new health dispensary and everybody's claiming credit. Like, what do we do? How do we make sense of this? So I'm wondering about this evaluative terrain, because you talk a little bit less about it, even though you attend to, this is in fact what gets selected, like what this kind of material work that gets done is actually communicative work, but how is it interpreted? How do people navigate this kind of thing? Particularly the legibility of this credit claiming in the context of the saturated media landscape of Indian cities. How does this work? And part of the reason, this is the theoretical point of this, for the stakes, the theoretical stakes for me, is because one tendency among scholars and theorists of democracy and politics, Indian and otherwise, is to counterpose pragmatic politics, the getting things done, with a politics that hinges on the formulation and communication of ideas or political agendas or, what's the word you use? Appeals, policy appeals. This is all kind of like spoken talk about talk, right? There's like, getting stuff done, and then there's talk, appealing. And this is something which theorists always are counterposing. And one question I often get about my own work is, okay, but like, what about the ideas? What about the discourse? But I think that when work is actually the terrain of interpretation and performance and can't be counterposed with other forms of communication, then this distinction collapses, right? Then we're just talking about political communication, whether it happens in words or water tanks or things, and then it becomes, and I think this is really important because what you're really talking about then at the end of the day isn't a theory of machine politics, but of political representation. And that's the word in your book I like a lot more. It's in the subtitle, How India's Urban Poor Seek Representation. And I think really what you're doing is offering us a theory of representation, not a theory of machine politics. I think you actually, because machine politics holds on to this counterposing of the kind of tit for tat with the word. And I'm out of time, so I'll keep the other stuff for dinner. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisa. Our next commentator is Siddharth Swaminathan. He is the econometric soul of our urban project. I don't know whether his comments are methodological today. I have no idea. He'll tell us. But he makes sure that our stats of our 17-city project are up to the mark. So he was until recently professor at the Azim Premji University in Bangalore, and before that the Institute of Social and Economic Change, which is where I first met him. And he's this year a visiting fellow at the Saxena Center, and we are doing a fair amount of writing over the next few months. Has a PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate School, and has published in American Journal of Sociology with us, in Economic and Political Weekly with us, at SKID with me, Journal of Conflict Resolution entirely by himself and some others, etc. So, Siddharth, your 12 minutes.
How do I?
Oh, I had slides. That's okay. I had good pictures.
Something happened?
They weren't slides. They're pictures of contractors.
Thank you for this opportunity. As with Lisa, I enjoyed this book tremendously for a variety of reasons. And I'll kind of quickly go over some of those reasons why I think this book is essential reading for students of Indian politics, South Asian politics, and required reading for courses on urban India and social science research design, especially in India, since these courses hardly include works such as this. So the book focuses on the relationships between three key actors: the residents of slums, political intermediaries, brokers, party workers, and political elites, in a single framework. Most studies focus on a single linkage mainly between a political leader and voters. By examining political linkages across three sets of actors, this work provides us with a complete picture of how political relationships unfold in slums in India. And this is a persuasive account of how residents of slums choose brokers. And as Tariq mentioned, education and occupational status become key elements. B, how brokers choose clients. And the factors here are those that enhance broker reputation, including whether a broker is seen as inclusive or not, and whether the client the broker targets are socially central slum residents. And see how party elites, such as ward councillors and ward corporators, choose their informal representatives, i.e. brokers, in slums, and this focuses on party loyalty, on efficacy, and the trade-offs involved, and so on. And all of this is seen in a single framework. Second, this work combines in-depth ethnographic work with careful experimental design and rigorous statistical modeling. Ethnographic work informs sampling, questionnaire design, and the experimental treatment included in these surveys. In India, sampling households and respondents, particularly in low-income neighborhoods, is an extremely tough task. Electoral lists generally work for rural India, but not for urban India, as they severely undercount individuals or get outdated very fast. Survey work in India requires teams to physically count households or residential structures, which is complicated by the fact that these are very dense neighborhoods. So it is impressive how the authors develop their sampling frame. Particularly impressive is how they generate this list from which to sample both party brokers as well as residents. So in that sense, the sampling strategy is extremely impressive, and the survey work as well. The authors also use a novel factorial design to evaluate the effect of different attributes on decision-making among slum dwellers as well as brokers. A critique that is directed at conjoint experiments is that one being complex and in that they evaluate multiple treatments, it's likely that they may heighten the salience of particular issues among respondents. That respondents who don't think about these issues in other circumstances are now forced to think about it and consequently give it a value which might not be accurate or might not be real. However, the authors take into account these sorts of criticisms and show that residents indeed can distinguish between social and political preferences, i.e. when choosing between brokers and neighbors, as they very elaborately go through a set of tests to show this, and for brokers as well. While the statistical model is generally straightforward, OLS, the authors conduct an extensive number of robustness checks that make their results credible and compelling. In terms of findings, their work is a strong counter to studies that examine politics as purely clientelist or vote bank politics. And more importantly, by focusing on politics between elections, their work highlights the routine yet important interactions between citizens and political actors. Findings, as noted earlier, suggest that there are factors that go beyond the role of caste and particularly the role of education and occupational status. The effect of religion makes sense. I'd like to know more about why regional status produce the kind of strong results that they do. Second, I have a set of questions for the authors. How generalizable are these results, particularly within India? And I'm thinking of southern Indian slums. Slum residents in southern India are somewhat more empowered. They participate more. They are more politically active. And women have play a particularly important role in low-income neighborhoods, in very low-income neighborhoods in places like Tamil Nadu and Kerala. While I'm not entirely sure about regional differences, but linguistic differences certainly exist in southern Indian slums. So what do you think would be the role of differences that are based on language? Second, this work very clearly focuses on slums and informal settlements, right? However, a feature of Indian cities is today a growing lower middle income group. Their lives are not characterized by the relatively high levels of poverty one observes in slums. They are generally part of a low-end service sector employment, retail workers, maybe lab technicians, not informal casual labor, but low-income jobs, but in the service sector. There are also government employees here, particularly state administrative services. While they do not face problems such as acute water shortages, sanitation problems, these problems here, they don't face, the problems they face are not as severe as those faced by some residents, but they still face water problems. They may have bigger buckets than slum residents, but they still have a problem with water, with garbage, with identity cards, and so on. Okay. They live generally in pakka housing structures, somewhat larger spaces than slum households. The structures are multi-level, they have larger windows, shared balconies. However, voting among this group is relatively low compared to slum residents. Non-voting participation is also somewhat low, as in participation in rallies, participation in between elections, in meetings, and so on. They are less aware of ward committee meetings. Their participation in civic activities is relatively low. They do not come together as often as slum residents do to address common neighborhood issues, nor do they have connections to high-ranking government officials, as the rich do, and generally are atomized. So how would a model such as this work in a situation where residents are not as poor as slum residents, and collective action problems might exist, more so than in slum neighborhoods? The second aspect of neighborhoods in India is that they generally tend to be very diverse. When you look at class distinctions, you show that in neighborhoods the fractionalization index is about 80%, but that's caste fractionalization. Here, our computations show that the likelihood that two randomly selected households are different in terms of structures is about 40%. So there is a somewhat high degree of class diversity within these neighborhoods. So again, we know that collective action problems increase in heterogeneous neighborhoods. So how would your model think of how these communities come together when choosing brokers, or how would brokers see these sorts of diverse mixed communities while choosing their clients? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, you can introduce yourself. Okay.
Yeah. We need
Time.
We need more time.
Oh,
We need more time. Okay.
We don't need introduction. Hi, my name is Patrick Heller.
And he's a professor of sociology.
Yes.
and I work with these characters.
And we work together.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Tariq, I think the term is often abused, but this for me is an instant classic. The depth of the empirical work, the ethnography, the 10 years that the two of you put into this, the survey data. I didn't need the experiments. I know in poli-sci you guys have to do experiments, otherwise, whatever. But I was convinced.
Now I'm tenure, I can do what I want.
Yeah. But the experiments are great. They're really great. They're very clear. Empirically, I think you've nailed it. This is the end of the debate. And it's about goddamn time. And this is my one quibble with the argument. I mean, the quid pro quo version of clientelism. I mean, I thought that was debunked. It should have been debunked ages ago. No. When's the last time, there's a few places in the world where you could still monitor votes, et cetera. But in India, that's not been possible for ages, right? And yet, political scientists keep coming back with this very traditional dyadic, single-stranded quid pro quo, right? You give me something, I'll vote for you, and it's somehow monitored. And you've put it to rest. And for me, it was already a dead horse, but let's flog it a little bit more, right? Because I know it's a big part of the literature. I'm going to have more to say about it, but first I want to, just building on the work we've done, it's the survey stuff in 17 cities, because it's not ethnographic. We do some focus groups, et cetera, but it's mostly a survey instrument. I just want to highlight a few findings that you'll find of interest, especially because we have Bhopal. We don't have Jaipur, but we do have Bhopal in the sample. So first of all, what's really, we ask people in different housing types, so including informal settlements, but all the way to the luxury places, how do you get stuff? How do you get access services when you need cards, whatever? And there's a tremendous variation across cities. So in some places, Vadodara, everyone goes to the bureaucracy. They actually go to the officials and say, I need my water tap. In other places, it's all corporators. In Kochi, 80% go to their corporators. And it doesn't matter what political party you're from, Muslim, Hindu, Christian, everyone goes to the corporator.
The table is there.
Yeah, no. And not many places rely that much on intermediaries. Because we have we ask, is it the corporator or the intermediary? But some places rely more on the intermediaries than others. Second, you're talking about incorporation. So we have a number of measures that might capture incorporation. One is we ask people if they know how to contact their corporator. And the findings here are all over the place. In Ajmer, only 6% of people in informal settlements know how to contact a corporator. In Bhopal, it's 44%. In Delhi, which does not surprise me at all, it's 10%. It's really hard to find your politicians in Delhi. They show up at election time, right? In Kolkata, it's 51%. In Chennai, there are no corporators, right? So everyone either protests or goes through intermediaries. So there's, at the end of the book, in the conclusion, can we generalize? And again, on the finding that slum dwellers are proactive, that they're choosing their brokers, that the brokers are responding to their needs and not just manipulating votes, et cetera. I think you could definitely generalize, but there's still tremendous institutional political variation across Indian cities, right? You mentioned 50 cities that are now million plus, so you've covered 2, so we need 24 more books, right? So there's some grad students here. And then finally, since we're talking, at least has talked about Mumbai, one of the findings for Mumbai that stunned us is that less than 50% of people are registered to vote in Mumbai. So forget political incorporation, right? And it's much higher in the informal settlement. So just 3 interesting data points for comparative purposes. So I want to push you a little bit on the model here, because yes, it's about party machines. It's not about, you've debunked the traditional clientelism argument, but this is still not constituency service. This is competitive clientelism, right? So instead of there being just one dominant party machine and people don't have a choice, and if they want to access state resources, they have to go through that party machine. Here, they could strategically play the BJP against the Congress, and that gives them some leverage and they get some stuff. But note that everything is still being intermediated by politicians. So this is still clientelism, right? This is still making rights through the mediation of party representatives. You're not going straight to you can't just claim your rights. You have to have someone broker your rights, right? So in terms of thinking about democracy, this is still a very suboptimal mode of incorporation, right? And that's implicit in how you framed it, but I would have just liked to see it said a little bit more directly. And then I want to pick up on how you ended your talk. You said there's real hard limits, and you didn't talk about them, understandably. So I'm going to talk about them, and just so we can continue the conversation. So 6 points. 1, this is party building. It's not democratic deepening. And I think we want to be really clear on that. There's some possibilities here, for sure, but in and of itself, it's still just competitive clientelism with brokered citizenship and highly differentiated citizenship. So the title of our paper in AJS is the poor have patrons and the rich have peers, which is a little more dramatic than the actual findings, but it's a title, right? So, but the fact is, Indian cities, like many other cities in the global south, or Chicago for that matter, have differentiated citizenship, right? And if you're in the slums, the only way to really secure anything, it's through politics or through political parties. Second, and Lisa picked up on this as well, you guys clearly say these are not programmatic parties, but there's no discussion of ideology. Everything is instrumental. Everything is calculated. There's no moral evaluative modes of community. I'm sure there are, but what you report is all about I'm picking this broker, and the broker is picking different residents, and it's all a calculation about political careers, et cetera. And then there's tons of party switching, right? And what's super interesting for me is that at the local level, the BJP is just another party delivering selective goods. And even Muslims join the BJP. And this is, for those of you who don't know, right, the BJP demonizes Muslims, right? So at the national level, of course, the BJP is highly ideological. At the local level, it's just another clientelistic machine. The distributive side of the story. What is the community actually getting? And I want to read what you guys say. Page 17. We argue this piecemeal politics ensures persistent forms of dependency, inhibits coordinated claim-making across settlements, and fails to deliver systematic policy-based improvement. Totally agree. And I want to be clear here, because you guys are very clear on this, and it's really important to emphasize the stuff your clients get from their brokers and from the patrons of the brokers, for people who live in these extraordinarily deprived conditions, is important stuff, right? Cleaning the sewers, getting an extra community toilet, et cetera. But compared to what other classes are getting in the city, this is a joke, right? And I mean, you know this stuff, but my favorite example is always Delhi and the JNNURM, which was the huge central government infusion of capital funds into cities, because the cities have no money, basically. And what did Delhi spend it on? Goddamn flyovers, right? And half the city doesn't have proper access to water, right? So instead of building out piped water systems, they're building middle-class flyovers, right? And so the distributive politics of Indian cities are still, extraordinarily elite-dominated. Fourth, and you don't quite say this, but again, it's implicit in the analysis, politicians themselves can't really do much. They have no choice but to engage in clientelistic politics. They can't deliver policy. And I think people don't quite realize this, but Indian cities do not legislate. A little regulatory stuff here and there. And councillors certainly don't legislate. The Delhi Council, someone once calculated, they met for all of 26 hours in an entire year, right? And we know they're not the ones making the decisions anyways. So when politicians can't do policy, what do? They distribute pork, right? And again, it's an incredibly constrained mode of politics, and as you and Adam point out, the goods have to be tagged. And I saw this in Delhi often. Politicians prefer tanker trucks to pipes. Because once the pipes are in, you can't put your name on the pipes, you can't put your name on the water, you could put your name on the tanker truck, right? And so again, suboptimal delivery of goods. 5, where is the bureaucracy in all this? And it's absent because it is absent. These are people who do not have access to the state. And that's not true everywhere in India. So in Vadodara, we found out 69% of people go straight to the officials. So they actually have access to the bureaucracy. And then 6, and this, I'm a political sociologist, so I have to ask this question. Where is civil society? There are no associations, at least that aren't tied to politicians. There are no movements. India's extraordinary in this sense, other than Mumbai maybe in the 70s, and now the Shiv Sena, maybe Aam Aadmi, but there are no urban movements in India, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that, but we can think of other places where there are lots of urban movements. Where's the rights-based demand making? There's people sort of strategically playing one broker against the other to get this small selective good, but where are the citizens demanding their rights? How much time do I have?
You're done.
I'm done. Okay, so just one quick comparative point. I'm thinking about Brazil. So Brazil had urban social movements, and today you go into the favelas of Sao Paulo, everyone's organized. There's associations everywhere, and they're all tied to the PT or the PSOL, which is to the left of the PT, but they're all autonomous. And they're constantly engaging directly with the state, not mediated by politicians. And in Trivandrum, in the slums, it's kind of the same story of strong associations, resident welfare associations for slums, who negotiate directly with the state. Again, no mediation through the CPM or any of the dominant political parties. And so I want to actually suggest that, especially in North India, the dominance of parties over intermediation comes at the expense of more citizens and rights-based forms of intermediation. And of course, there's a big difference between North and South in the timing of movements and parties. And that in that sense, it's parties themselves that are in a way part of the problem in terms of developing deeper forms of democratic engagement. So, but it's an extraordinary book, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
All right, come here. Guys, come here. Can you sit next to me?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Can't just sit here.
No, everybody.
It's fine.
Come, yeah.
Should we
Let
open
me-
it up
yeah,
or?
let me ask you.
Yes.
What would you like? We leave it to the author. Would you like to hear more comments from the audience, or would you like to respond to some of what you heard?
Well, I think the audience has been very patient, so I think I'd like to open it up. Maybe I'll just take 2 minutes to just highlight a couple
Yeah.
of the points. I obviously, first, thanks to everyone, and I won't try and respond to all of them. Let me say just a couple of things. One is, I do think that, so first of all, Lisa, you're absolutely right. A missing arena is how brokers select parties. We thought about it, and the reason we don't do it, and I think this could also vary by context, is that while brokers do switch in our study settings, because they're two parties, there are always more of them than there are kind of local political patrons. And so we found, a little bit differently than in your context, where the top-down does kick in is when you want that party position. And so we found it, I mean, everything is going on. It's not that brokers don't have some choice, but they have much more constrained choice. And so the power dynamic that we thought was more interesting was the patron selecting. But that could vary. If you have a multi-party setting in India, we have, in both of our states, there are only these two parties, but in some Indian states, there are multiple parties. In other contexts, you may have many more parties. That could change the power dynamic depending on how many brokers there are versus how we have 6 to 10 brokers per settlement. And so there's just, with this level of competition at that level, that's what we were finding as the effect. And so that's partly why we didn't do it, but there is something I think interesting about that dynamic. In terms of the distinction, I think we are offering a theory of representation, but we're trying to say that machine politics is often juxtaposed with politics of representation and accountability. We think that organizationally this looks a lot like machine politics, the anatomy of it, the organizational form, but let's bring dynamics of representation into it and not just material benefit flows. And those things are tied up because what people are wanting is often material, so the representation question is mixed in. But who is in it opens up the question of representation in a way. But to very quickly to Siddharth's point, I think that's fascinating. One thing we mention in the book that is unique about some settlements is that they're ethnically diverse but class-wise homogeneous. That is an interesting but also idiosyncratic setting. So it means it dilutes the importance in some ways of ethnic, specifically caste, where it's super diverse, as a tool of coalition building, and it ramps up the kind of class-wise solidarities even in terms of what you're demanding. Think of some of the canonical theories of ethnic politics emerging out of places like sub-Saharan Africa, where you have spatially bounded ethnic groups. Right? The logic is a bit inverted. You may have class-wise heterogeneity, but ethnic homogeneity within space. Why that matters, I think, is that it changes the political calculation of even these local political operatives. So the brokers we find, and I didn't present that part, often are indifferent in picking clients from different ethnic groups and their own. They don't actually have strong favoring their own in who they're kind of trying to be responsive to. And that is very much set by this profile. I think if we went into diverse urban neighborhoods, I think we would find a different set of political configurations. Not just the point you mentioned that there's some more political apathy in these areas. I think a lot of that is driven by underdevelopment. Slum residents cannot afford to be politically inactive in our settings. That is, as Patrick said, what they have. Lower middle class and eviction in particular, the threat of eviction, which the neighborhoods you're talking about do not face, really is a background condition. It doesn't mean it's happening every day, but the reality that could happen any day really drives constant political engagement. And also, every public good they get is in some ways off the books in a way that is not true of these lower middle income neighborhoods. So I think that drives the different form of politics and why slums are often at the epicenter. The second point is they turn out to vote. I mean, the reported turnout rates, but even some of the aggregate turnout rates are 80, 90%. In middle class areas of these same cities, it's half that. It's 45 to 50%. So this is where a lot of the action is. And I think that makes for a big difference. But I think that's an important point. And Patrick, thanks for that. I think several of your points are well taken. I'll just touch on one, which is the idea that politicians can't really change this equilibrium. I think one of it only because it builds on work I'm currently doing in small towns. And that point, I think, does resonate even outside of bigger cities. So small town elected officials who actually have constituency sizes of 800, 900 voters, they're very local politicians, much more so than the ones we study in this book. Even they have no idea what to do. So we actually assess a knowledge assessment among small towns, and Anirvan's work was essential in allowing us to actually sample this. So it's nice to have him here. And we find they basically know nothing about what they're supposed to do, let alone, I mean, they don't even know they're supposed to collect house tax. They don't know that their signatures are needed on different approval forms. So legislation is very far away. They don't even know their basic implementing abilities. What they largely do is a lot of what we're showing here. And so the role has both, I think there's also some mimicry that happens. That's all that the system knows. And when you come in as a new counselor, that's kind of what you're socialized into doing. And I do think that that's a persistent problem, even where there are rules on the books that you could do more, even in spaces where you could maybe make some policy. You tend not to, and it's not even in the ether of something that you're expected to do. And that is a pernicious kind of trap and equilibrium. But I'll stop there.
18 minutes left, 3:40. I'll just take 2 minutes, and then we open up. So Susan Stokes et al., in the clientelism book that became a classic, there's a very puzzling part of that book, that Peronistas down at the bottom can monitor votes. They know how their clients are voting. And then I said, how is this possible? That is not an Indian slum. I know. How do you monitor votes? It's secret vote. And secrecy can be, all you know is which neighborhood might have voted this way, but not which individuals.
Yeah.
And then Stokes says that her survey of Peronista lower level network suggests that 53% of them said that they knew how their clients voted. First of all, 53% is still not too large. It's quite large, but not so large as to say that you can actually predict or actually know how. I remember it's 53%. That's what she said. And then he said that's how monitoring takes place. you are also saying vote monitoring of this kind is impossible. Right?
Yeah.
So clientelism in this sense doesn't work. Clientelism in some other sense may work,
Right.
but not that I will withdraw my patronage if you don't vote for me. Because I don't know how you voted.
Yeah.
You can't buy a vote, she wrote.
Yeah.
Right? And she wrote through systematic ethnography of Mumbai, right? Okay, so that done. In other words, I'm saying that the way you're describing clientelism is very different from the clientelism.
Correct.
Yeah, this is not, whether we should use the term clientelism is a separate issue, but this is not the same clientelism.
No.
That I know how my client has voted. The second is this, I think at some point we need to figure this out, and I don't know how you wish to tackle this question. The deeply ideological politics at the national and central level, and provincial level, and the completely unideological politics they're describing down below.
Yeah.
What's the connect? Why are we getting this ambiguity or paradoxical divergence or contradiction, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah.
You're saying there's no evidence of ideology below. And I think others are also agreeing to it to some extent, maybe not entirely, but to some extent. Lisa was headed in some ideological direction, I think, but I may be wrong.
Not personally, but
yeah. So something about that would be nice.
Yeah.
And on Patrick's question.
Yeah.
Yes, I have 30 seconds more. On Patrick's question about movements versus parties.
Yes.
Amit Ahuja's book, at least on Dalits, is very clear.
Yeah.
South India produced movements before political parties emerged, representing lower castes.
Yeah.
North India presented parties first before movement. We don't know where movements are. Parties represented lower castes, right?
Yes.
Whereas movements represented lower castes in southern India, and including Maharashtra, because Dalit movement was very serious under Ambedkar, which changes the dynamic of how the subaltern act politically.
Correct. Yeah.
Right? So just at least these two ideas we can comment on.
Yeah.
The north-south difference on movement versus parties. Secondly, this national political ideological polarization and instrumental behavior down below. If you can just spend, hold off on that. Let's see where they are.
Okay.
What are the questions that audience wants?
Sure. Let's go for it.
Gemma Dipopa, then yes. Yeah.
So I was wondering something along the lines of what Patrick had in mind, which is in which neighborhoods there are brokers emerging and in which other neighborhoods there aren't. And I was thinking that perhaps this has something to do exactly with findings that you presented, which is that those are people that are, in these slums, there are people that are highly educated, but with low economic returns from their education. So is it possible that slums have brokers because educated people have lower possibility economically than in places where educated people would do better and would have prospects of career that are higher paid and more certain career?
I should add for the audience here that Gemma has worked on southern Italian migration into North Italian cities. So I think maybe some of that is coming from there.
So let me respond to your question first, Gemma, and then I can respond to a couple of Ashu's. So I think we actually do talk about the kind of supply side of brokerage, and that's very much in that. It's not just the brokers being selected, but you need people who are willing to do that work. And absolutely. So if you think about what percentage of our settlement have formal sector jobs, jobs in the government service or some kind of salaried job, it's in the single digits. The largest category of workers are manual laborers. So these are conditions of, less than 5% have like contracted work. So it's, that's where the informality comes from. But there is a much larger percentage who have college education, and certainly 8th grade education or higher. And so there is, in some ways, especially among male brokers, this supply of educated and relatively underemployed, if not fully unemployed, and brokerage becomes one way to supplement. To Lisa's question of where are the fees, our brokers do charge fees for these certain services like documents, etc., not so much for relaying the message onto politicians. But I think very much so that also informs their careerism, which is for them, the real payoff is if they actually get into getting either a party ticket or a level position. If you get a block or district level position, then you can start to imagine the rents from that actually being a viable career. We do have some slum leaders who get into that, who make it there. So I definitely think that that's important. And another distinction from Siddharth's neighborhoods, you may have, if you have a government job, it's very unlikely that you would leave that to spend the time in brokerage, other than perhaps potentially in the margins. And also to Lisa's point, that a larger city like Mumbai, there may be more pathways into brokerage. There are a variety of brokers, and brokers often will call themselves social workers, but 90% of them almost are party affiliated. So social work is a rhetorical device, and that was true even in my first book. I found, people who are social workers were full-time RSS workers, very ideological actors, but they're social workers, and that's both a discursive and even a deeply held belief about what they do. So I do think that distinction matters. Ashu, on your question, first of all, on the monitoring point, this is a big debate. I don't want to get into too much in the weeds of it, but I do think that we are not alone in saying that particular dimension may not be necessary for this kind of material politics to matter. There's a review essay by Alan Hicken and Noah Nathan which suggests that they call it clientelism's red herring. And essentially they say this fixation that you have to be able to individually monitor may not be necessary for a lot of this. So I think part of our point is maybe in some settings it happens, it doesn't. It's organizationally very intensive. And most importantly, in our setting, brokers themselves say we don't really spend much time doing that. Our effort is better directed to solving people's problems and building reputations and goodwill than like fixating on people. They even say people come to rallies. In Hindi, they said, the version of everybody gets biryani at my rally and their rally too, so they'll come to all of the rallies, right? And I would do the same thing. So I have to have the rally to show that I matter, right? To show that it's skin in the game. And Simone Chachard has work on this, suggesting that it's more skin in the game to do all of this, all of this performance, rather than actually persuading people to vote. The second point that you meant about this disjuncture, I think that's the big question, right? And I think you can read it in two different ways, which is, on the one hand, we cannot deny the ideological polarization happening in national and even state level politics. I mean, we have 2 state elections in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh happening right now. In the Madhya Pradesh election, the chief ministerial candidate of the Congress is increasingly taking a hardline Hindu nationalist position to kind of ward off a challenge, right? So I don't think anybody can argue that that's not what's going on. I think the question, what we look at is either, is this about to diffuse downwards, and is everything that we're seeing about to break? Or is it that local politics offers in some ways a bulwark against homogenizing the view of what's happening at the top? I think that's the view that we take, that voters can behave somewhat differently. We do see ideology matter in little picks and starts. We see some BJP brokers join for ideological reasons, but it's a minority. We see some Muslims saying we would never join the BJP, but we also find 20% of Muslim brokers are with the BJP. It's not 50, it's not as much as the Congress, but that's still relatively high. So I think what we've come down on is the idea that local politics and its intense materiality
is relatively autonomous.
Is relatively, in voters and how they inhabit those relations. They do not go to their counselor for ideological messaging. They do not go to their broker for ideological messaging. That doesn't mean that their broker can't be on a WhatsApp group with them dispensing all kinds of content that might be polarizing. But I think that the world we saw, and this extended up until 2020 really, just before the pandemic, when all of this was happening, the 2019 election had happened, all of this stuff is happening at the national level, we didn't see evidence of that reverberating. Now, whether that will change over time, it's tough to say. And whether, for example, the incumbency advantage, the BJP wins a third election, will that lead to increasingly them dominating the brokerage space? So far, it hasn't. So far, we still see the Congress getting brokers, people joining the Congress at this level. So the dominance you see at the national level is not replicated yet. And that has to do, I think, a little bit with the materiality of the politics. But that's my thought.
Danny.
So what a wonderful book. I had a lot of fun reading it.
Thank you, Danny.
I guess I wanted to push you a little bit on this point about broker agency, which I think Lisa mentioned. So it seems to me there's a weird paradox in that the brokers that are the most influential and the most desirable by these parties are considered desirable are the ones that have the most sort of clout with their clients, right? And those people actually have credibility in terms of threatening to leave and vote for the other side. And that seems to me like an interesting idea, because you want to keep the partisan loyal brokers, but the ones that have the most clout with the clients might be the most likely to defect. So how does that mid-level politician navigate that sort of, it seems pretty treacherous. And so the second question is more on sort of the implications of your argument. If your model that, it's not about partisanship driving, but it's about patron-client relationships, does your sort of book predict increased partisan volatility in the long run? Because these brokers are mobile, that would sort of hint towards a Lucas Novaes kind of world where
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
disloyal brokers are contributing to
Yeah.
volatility? Or
Yeah.
do you think there's some way of managing this dynamic
Yeah.
so that it consolidates partisan stability at the local level?
So, excellent questions. Let me take them quickly, in reverse order. On the partisanship question, so one thing that we mentioned in the book, and that I think is really not just our work, but a lot of work on India shows, is how incredibly volatile politics is at all levels. So we have voters openly saying they switch parties. Like over a third of them openly report that. We have brokers saying they switch parties. We even have patrons. Patrons are less likely to report it, but when we trace their political careers, we see quite a lot of switching even among party patrons. So it's an incredibly volatile system. Work by others has shown that rerunning rates in India are very low. So it's not just that incumbents are disadvantaged, but incumbents often don't even get renominated to contest again. So there's a lot of, and that's at the state level as well, so even a level higher than what we're looking at. There's a lot of volatility in Indian politics, which mitigates against the forming of hard partisan identities. At the same time, there's some recent work that's coming out that's showing some forms of partisan attachment in India are increasing. And this is another place where this disjuncture, I think, may be relevant. At the local level, I actually don't see any mechanism for partisan attachment stabilizing at that local level. People moving take voters with them. But a lot of studies of kind of social behavior that pitch a little bit higher are finding, especially around the BJP, the emergence of a partisan identity. We actually found in a study on air pollution, totally unrelated to this, that selective blame along partisan lines is very strong in the city of Delhi along BJP and AAP voters on an issue that's not even very heavily at this point politicized or polarized in the same way. So I think in India right now we see both logics, but in this world we see a little bit of that kind of low partisanship logic. On the first question, this is a dilemma that patrons are openly talking about, loyalty versus efficacy. Distribution-wise, when we look at our brokers, there is a bit of a trade-off because there are very few who are both loyal and effective. I think it's only 6 or 7% who score high on both. So that trade-off does bite. We do some analysis in the conjoints to show that when pushed, they privilege loyalty if they have to choose, and they have to choose quite a lot. But in some ways, this is not something that they're fully able to resolve. And it is the case that effective brokers often say, I want to be that guy. I want to be a candidate. I want to be the ticket holder, right? And they'll say to us, I was with somebody who was the broker for a patron, and the moment the patron left, he said that, because he was talking about how he thinks he's going to get a candidacy in the next election, and the broker told me, how is he going to get a candidacy? It's going to be mine, right? So there's clear ambition that mitigates against this, and patrons know this, and they have to negotiate it, and the solution, they don't have a ready-made solution to it.
We have 4 minutes left. Nirvan.
And Shreya, yeah. Let me take both and then I can
Yeah,
respond.
let's take both.
Yeah.
Anirban, you
we
first.
take both of them and then I'll
Yeah,
respond.
and we'll take both and then, yeah. Anirban.
Okay, so quickly, a really fascinating book. One of the things that I wanted to figure out is in terms of your operationalization of competence through education.
Yeah.
So how much of the effect for education that you see is a function of an experimental artifact or social desirability? So for example, let's look at a slightly different situation. So there is a political party that comes into power and imposes an educational requirement for a certain punch position.
Yeah.
So when that happens, how do people actually like that? What's the reaction on the ground? I have a prior, but I'm curious about what your prior is. The second question that I have, actually have a bunch, but I'll be very quick.
Yeah.
But to be consistent with the theme.
Yeah.
So you have, as Danny mentioned, brokers in some position, in a way, can be the most powerful in a certain way, group in this way. But when when we're looking at agency, we see where do brokers get agency from? Because they're dependent on citizens in one place, and then for their upward mobility, they're dependent on the patrons or the politicians.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about where brokers get their agency from.
Interesting.
Shreya?
Thanks, Tariq.
Yeah.
My question is about the distribution of migrants. I'm thinking about short-term migrants,
Mhm.
particularly people who, the ones who had to leave Delhi during pandemic and who may not be voting in cities.
Yeah.
What role do they play in this whole?
Yeah. Let me take the last question first. So yeah, I've done a lot of work on circular migrants previous to this book. In fact, that's what drew me to this book. And they are a population in our slum, but quite a small one. So we don't actually we have some renters, for example, but almost everybody in our sample is not a circular migrant. And so almost everybody is registered to vote in the city. Part of the reason for that is actually the slums, squatter settlements are not the primary location where circular migrants live. They live in a combination of either hostels, tenements that are not actually in slums, that are purposely built as like rentals.
Shacks. Shacks.
Or the footpath.
Yeah, footpath.
And so they are actually even poorer than our residents. These are the lowest rung of the settled migrant community, I would say. And circular migrants don't fully fit into that picture. But they are an important presence in all cities, including, I mean, they are a bulk of the construction labor in most of these cities, including Jaipur and Bhopal. Anivan, on your question, yeah, we wrestled a lot. We didn't start out thinking about education. It was something that we asked people. Part of what we were trying to get at was this chicken and egg problem that people always say, people who like brokers who have established records, but to establish the record, you need a following. So we were saying, when someone's coming up, what do you look for? And we kept hearing education mentioned. That somebody who padha likha hona chahiye should have some amount of literacy. The college education is a high level, and actually you see even the 8th level in both the choice experiments and in observational stuff, pops. It's often enough to get access into this. And I don't think that that's actually incorrect. I was very skeptical of that because I thought all the political selection literature tells us is either just you're picking who the elite are, but we found that wasn't the case descriptively in our setting. I think that would be true overall. But the second thing is that maybe it's just people telling you what you want to hear. But every time we've done this, observationally, everything, education keeps popping, including in 2020, we did a resurvey during COVID lockdown, where we actually tried to contact slum leaders by phone to just say what's going on, because everybody was saying how slums are going to be the hotspots in India, but nobody was going inside slums. So we said, what's going on? And we also asked them, can you identify the relief schemes? We tested them on how many relief schemes do you know that are operating, and have you been contacted by a politician? And the biggest predictor of both was education, once again. So I don't think brokers are totally incorrect in valuing that. Whether they would value that as a criteria for formal candidacy, I think is a little bit different. There they may be inclined to say it's a good thing. The people I've spoken to in small towns in Rajasthan don't mind it as a criteria. But there are also all kinds of other dynamics about caste, privilege that get looped into candidacy. So I don't know that I would totally extrapolate from that. The second thing about where do they get their agency, I think that's a great question. I think that where we saw, it is a constrained agency, right? You lose your agency if you lose your following. And we've seen that when we've gone to resample. We've seen people who we talked to who were influential brokers in 2016. A couple of them by 2020, people were like, nobody goes to that person anymore. I just went back to Jaipur over the summer, and I went back to a couple of the settlements. We did our case study. There's turnover in brokerage as well. There's, it's not a fixed environment, which speaks to where their agency is constrained, and it's constrained at the top. At the same time, where they do have agency is people from outside cannot come in. I think it's a relatively meritocratic part of Indian political selection. None of them are dynasts. They're first-generation migrants, right? This is not, they're low income. So to the degree that anybody who's a political entrant in India has some agency, and it's not all predetermined by who your father was or your mother was, they may be some of the few who actually have a meritocratic shot at political entry. So it's a constrained agency, but I still think it's there and it's meaningful.
Well, Patrick called this an instant classic.
Then it must be true.
Yeah. And let me tell you about their next project, which will be, I think, an instant classic. Let me tell you why. So the urban research so far has typically not gone below 500,000 size of the city. We have 2-3 cities where 300,000. Okay, it has certainly not gone below 100,000. Their next project is about cities all over the state of Rajasthan, or towns, let's call them towns, less than 100,000 in population, which is a part of the urban universe in India that nobody understands anything about. So we look forward to that, and we will have a book adda.
In 9 to 10 years, all of you would have moved on to bigger, better things. Yeah.
So, right, with that, it's time to...
Thank you so much.
You can pursue the conversation outside. There is reception. And it's time to thank Tariq and my commentators.
Thank you so much to them.